Good evening to everyone here in East Asia. Good morning to colleagues in the UK and Europe. Good afternoon to anyone joining us from one of the many time zones in between. And welcome to this talk hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. We are very honored this evening to be joined by Professor Mohammad Shahabuddin, Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Birmingham Law School in the UK. In addition to the paper he will present for us tonight, Professor Shahabuddin is the author of several leading works in international law, including Ethnicity and International Law Histories, Politics and Practices, from Cambridge University Press in 2016, Minorities and the Making of Post-Colonial States in International Law, also from CUP in 2021. He's an editor of Bangladesh and International Law, published by Routledge in 2021, and he's on the editorial board of the Asian Journal of International Law. So truly a very impressive background and set of publications in I guess the contemporary context and the historical context relating to the themes he'll be discussing this evening. So tonight's talk is titled Pan-Asianism, Anti-Imperialism and International Law, Historical Perspectives. And it's based on a very, very interesting paper that I encourage everyone to read if you haven't had a chance to do so already, which explores sort of the development of Pan-Asianism, Pan-Asianist thinking in the early 20th century and the various different aspects of the political contestations around that, the linkages to developments in international law, as I'm sure we'll hear much more about in the coming hour or so. So just by way of brief details, so Professor Shahabuddin will present his paper. We will then open the floor to questions and answers. If you have any questions that occur to you during the talk, feel free to send them to me. You can send them to me in the chat if you would rather that I present your questions. Also, you can just let me know you have a question and you would like to be unmuted to ask it directly, because I know it's always very, very difficult to put things into text, or raise your hand or send a message once we get to the Q&A, and that will be perfectly fine too. So without further ado, Professor Shahabuddin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Roberts, for your extremely kind introduction. And it is indeed my honor to be part of your seminar series. And I'm immensely grateful to you for inviting me and to give me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on one of my recent papers on Pan-Asianism. I have some slides to share. Let me try and see how they go. I believe it is up and you can see it.
Yes, looks good.
Yeah, fantastic. So as you know, the title of my paper is Pan-Asianism, Anti-Imperialism and International Law, Historical Perspectives. When I say historical perspectives, I'm primarily going to focus on a very specific episode of the development of international law, which is the early 20th century, when this concept of Pan-Asianism played a key role as an anti-imperial rhetoric and strategy and ideology in that precise moment in time. So let's find out a bit more. And of course, as Chris was saying, I'll be very happy to take questions and to reflect on my own thinking. Now, as a concept, Pan-Asianism is conventionally associated with Japan's imperialism against Asian neighbors during the Second World War. That's what we know. That Pan-Asianism was used by the Japanese political elites to advance their own imperial project. And to make it even more certain, one of the most prominent Pan-Asianist ideologue in Japan, known as Shumei Okawa, was a Class A defendant at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which came to be known as the Tokyo Trial. The International Prosecution Section of the Tokyo Tribunal formulated the conspiracy charge almost entirely on the basis of his writing, advocating the unity of colored people and calling for resistance against the West. So this anti-white rhetoric was seen as one of the kind of key elements for prosecuting him as a class A defendant at the Tokyo Tribunal. But he was ultimately excused from the trial due to his mental illness. As you can see in this picture, he was constrained by military police because just before that, he started slapping the bald plate of General Tojo, who is sitting in front of him. So this image is from actual trial. Uh, so due to this alleged close association between Pan-Asianism and Japan's imperialism, there was a tacit yet firm endeavor by post-war Asian studies scholars in Japan and beyond to disassociate themselves from his work and from Pan-Asianist discourse in general. However, important revisionist accounts of Pan-Asianism, especially in the disciplines of international relations and Asian studies, have recently emerged. For example, Eri Hota's influential work on Pan-Asianism challenges the conventional understanding of Pan-Asianism as merely a language of Japanese hegemony in the continent, presenting it in a more nuanced way as a heterodoxic concept. First, what she called theist Pan-Asianism, which is a civilizational discourse emphasizing commonalities in the philosophical domain of the Asian civilization, which included both China and India. Second, cynic Pan-Asianism, which is a basis for an alliance among Asian nations, especially within the narrower geopolitical and cultural confines of East Asian nations. And finally, what she calls the core, a Meishuron Pan-Asianism, which was the language of Japanese expansionism in the name of protecting Asia from Western imperialism. So in Hota's account, or revisionist account, Pan-Asianism appears in its multiplicity at different levels. Similarly, equally important works by Prasenjit Duara or Camille Aydin have also problematized the conventional understanding of Pan-Asianism and articulated the concept in its multiplicity. It is indeed true that Japan used Pan-Asianist language for its imperialism. The increasing inclination towards anti-Western rhetoric and simultaneous imagination of Japan as the leader in Asia culminated in the official policy of what we now know, the condemned term of Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere in 1940. Japan also convened the Greater East Asia Conference in November 1943 to ensure enhanced support from Asian countries in face of worsening war situation. So Japan's Pan-Asianism was in many ways a language and a rhetoric to advance its own imperialism by using this anti-West rhetoric. And it's true. And by then, no doubt, Japan's leadership in the Pan-Asianist campaign had become a cause of grave concern for other Asian nations who saw how Pan-Asianism was rapidly evolving into a rhetoric for legitimizing Japanese colonial rule over Asia. However, and that is my intervention, far from being merely a language of hegemony and power put forward by Japan for its imperial projects in Asia, Pan-Asianism had a far more complex role to play in early 20th century, which we don't really talk about much, and that is what we are going to focus on from now on. So first, let me explain Pan-Asianism as an anti-imperial ideology. It cannot be denied that as an anti-imperial ideology, Pan-Asianism put forward a normative argument for the emancipation of Asia from Western imperialism in the early 20th century. It provided an alternative vision of civilization premised upon a shared Asian spirituality, heritage and culture and glorious past, no matter how fictitious such a common Asian identity was. And we have to understand this whole construct of Asia in itself is a colonial construct. And it did so by going beyond the dominant Eurocentric discourse on civilization. So this ideology of Pan-Asianism in itself was a resistance to the Western construction of what civilization is. Writing in the early 20th century, the Japanese literary figure and art enthusiast Kakuzo Okakura, who is also known as Tenshin, presented an ideological vision of Pan-Asianism that romanticizes the spiritual heritage of Asia and juxtaposes this with Western materialism to make a case for Asian reawakening against Western imperialism. In his The Ideals of the East, published in 1903, and originally in English because his primary audience was Indians and other Westerners, Okakura showcases the spiritual aspect of what amounts to a singular Pan-Asian identity. I quote him in his words, Asia is one. The Himalayas divide only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, the Chinese with its communism of Confucianism, and the Indian with its individualism of the Vedas. But not even the snowy barriers can interrupt for one moment that broad expanse of love for the ultimate and the universal. Unquote. But he also regretted that India lost its independence through spiritual apathy, lack of organization, and the petty jealousies of rival interests. Similarly, the Opium War in China and the gradual succumbing of almost all Eastern nations to the superior naval power of the West brought back the dread image of the Tatar Armada. At the core of this cultural humiliation of Asia, he argues in the Book of Tea, published in 1906, was, I quote, either impotent fanaticism or else abject voluptuousness on part of the West, which made no genuine efforts to understand Asia. To get rid of such indignation, according to Kakura, Asia must first develop a consciousness of the glorious Asian past, ancient models of life and society, and then protect and restore those Asiatic modes. The romantic depiction of Pan-Asianism as a unitary Asian whole, defined by a philosophical, moral, and cultural harmony, simultaneously assigns Japan the sacred role of leading the rest of Asia to self-consciousness and spiritual reawakening. This is because while the two great Asian civilizations, India and China, lost their glory, Japan, according to him, due to its unbroken sovereignty and insular isolation, which protected its ancestral ideas and instincts, emerged as the real repository of the trust of Asian thought and culture. In his words, I quote, Japan is the museum of Asian civilization, unlike China or China or India. In this regard, the Pan-Asianist ideology of the most prominent Bengali literary figure and Nobel laureate for peace in 1913, Rabindranath Tagore, needs to be briefly discussed. Tagore had a significant influence on Okakura, who visited India in 1901 and spent a year traveling and living in Tagore's household. The philosophical premise of Tagore's Pan-Asianism can be inferred from his thoughts on nationalism. In his lecture, Nationalism in the West, which was a part of a series of lectures delivered throughout the United States during the winter of 1916 and 17, Tagore exposed the menace of Western nation. This nation is the organized self-interest of a whole people where it is the least human and the least spiritual. It is an applied science, which is almost similar in its principles wherever it is used. Tagore, however, draws a distinction between the nation of the West and the spirit of the West and notes that whenever people in Asia have received the true lesson of the West, it is in spite of the Western nation. This is because the spirit of conflict and conquest, not social cooperation, was at the core of Western nation. It is for this reason, Tagore argues, that any progress of non-European nations, such as Japan, even in the mirror image of the European worldviews, was immediately met with suspicion and disapprobation from the West. However, during his visit to Japan in 1916, Tagore reminded the Japanese that their nation's immense potential and promise lie in the Eastern spiritual civilization and not in Western materialism. For Tagore, the rise of Japan epitomizes how the ancient Asian culture could set the premise for a modern future of a nation. Tagore's perspectives on nationalism not only expose the inherent limitation of Western civilization due to its exclusive nature and materiality, but also offers an alternative vision of a more spiritual and humane civilization that has its root in the ancient Asian culture, thereby setting the philosophical premise for Pan-Asianism, even if Tagore did not use that term. Now, in addition to the ideological function, as an anti-imperial strategy, Pan-Asianism offered Indian nationalist leaders in exile the language they needed to gain support from the Japanese and the Chinese in favor of their nationalist movement against British rule in India. The Pan-Asianist slogan, Asia for the Asiatics, was simultaneously a call to end European imperialism in Asia and an invitation to Japan to lead this anti-imperial campaign. Indian nationalists in exile used the Pan-Asianist ideology to mobilize support in Japan and China for their nationalist movement against British rule in India. Especially during the Great War and its immediate aftermath, Indian nationalists in exile were involved in the creation of a series of pan-Asiatic organizations in Asia, mainly in Japan. These organizations did not enjoy any direct official support from the Japanese government, although in some cases, leading politicians and influential individuals offered generous help at that time. The Pan-Asiatic League, created in Japan in 1917, with the active involvement of Okawa and his Indian revolutionary friends such as Rash Behari Bose or H.L. Gupta, was one of the early Pan-Asianist organizations with the objective of studying Asian civilization, cultivating mutual understanding among Asian nations, realizing the ideals of the Asiatic civilization, and of course, bringing peoples in Asia into unity. These apparently harmless agendas caused serious concerns within British official circles. In a letter of 12 June 1917, the General Commanding Officer of the Straits Settlement informed the governor of the settlements that he had, I quote, absolutely reliable information that Pan-Asiatic movement was extremely dangerous to British interest, unquote. To him, the purpose of the movement was to undermine British influence and the prestige of Britain in Japan, China, India, and the East generally in any way possible. The British officials were concerned about the various anti-British propaganda activities of Indian nationalist leaders in the Far East under the banner of Pan-Asianism, as revealed by a secret memorandum by C.J. Davidson, who was the British consul in Tokyo at that time. According to Davidson, the creation of the Pan-Asiatic League with the avowed objective of unifying Asiatic nations against the rule of white races contributed to Bose and his associates' success in gaining sympathy and cooperation from at least some Japanese radicals, for, in their eyes, such a unified Asia was going to be placed under the leadership of Japan. During the Great War, some Indian revolutionary leaders in exile in the United States were also actively involved in pan-Asiatic activities to mobilize their support base in China and Japan. Indian radical nationalist leaders in California worked closely with the Irish nationalists and the German authorities to oust the colonial British government in India. These activities came to be known as the Hindu-German conspiracy, and in 1917, the US federal government indicted 105 persons of various nationalists for using US territories as a base for German-financed schemes to promote a rebellion against British rule in India. Of them, 35, including 17 Indian, were apprehended and brought to trial before a San Francisco court where the full scale of the conspiracy was revealed. Taraknath Das was one of the Indian convicts in the Hindu-German conspiracy, for which he served a 22-month prison sentence. He was forced to flee India in 1906 as a suspected terrorist and traveled to Japan before moving to the US. He was actively involved in Indian nationalist activities in San Francisco and also visited China to advance the Pan-Asiatic movement and enhance Chinese support for Indian freedom from British rule. His book, Is Japan a Menace to Asia?, shared a vision of Asia's future imagined through three main Asian powers, Japan, China, and India. Working together harmoniously, he hoped, these three Asian powers would end European and American dominance in Asia. According to a secret memorandum of the colonial Indian Criminal Intelligence Department, another Indian revolutionary, C.K. Chakravarti, formed the Pan-Asiatic League in the US in order to obtain Chinese assistance in the furtherance of plots against British rule in India, especially in importing arms and explosives from China into India, for which the Chinese were less liable to be suspected than were Indians. The memorandum further noted that Chakravarti's plan was to get the Chinese government to buy arms in large quantities in the US and then to arrange to ship those to India in return for financial help from Germany. However, despite some initial success, by the end of 1916, it became quite clear to all parties involved that the plan had failed. The victory of Japan and the Allies in the Great War not only dashed the hope of Indian independence in
Like we might have had a temporary connection issue. Please bear with us while the speaker reconnects to the session.
Sorry, I was kicked out from the Zoom room. I'm not sure whether the problem is at my end, but I'm not sure how far actually I could go.
Yes, you had just we had just discussed sort of the Hindu-German conspiracy, and then we heard you mentioned that the victory of the Allies.
Right. So not that very far. So the victories of allies dashed the hope that Indian nationalists could actually make much progress in this way in collaboration with the Chinese and the Japanese to kind of put together a great fight against the British using the rhetoric of Pan-Asianism. So the point I was trying to make here is, first we talked about how Pan-Asianism was used as a language of ideology, which managed to, in the writings of Tagore and Okakura, which managed to offer an alternative narrative of civilization based on Asian spirituality as opposed to Western materialism. So that was the ideological part. But at the same time, Indian nationalist leaders in exile, primarily in Japan and in the US, they used this language of Pan-Asianism as a political strategy to secure support from other Asian countries so that they could fight back European and especially British rule in India. So therefore, my argument is that Pan-Asianism also had kind of strategic relevance in addition to its ideological function uh, in that sense. So after the war, Japan developed. So as I said, the victory of Britain and the Allies in the Great War dashed that hope that anything might happen in that way. It also made their former sympathizers in Japan about the capacity of those Indian rebels in Japan and in China regarding how far they can actually go. After the war, Japan developed its own version of Pan-Asianism for its own imperial purposes, as we discussed at the beginning. And within India itself, Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910 and its control over Manchuria in China led to complete disillusionment with Japan and its leadership role in Asia. So that was kind of almost the rhetorical death of Pan-Asianism when it comes from the Indian side. Thus, the exposure of the multiplicity of ways in which the concept was used for anti-imperial purposes offers a nuanced understanding of Pan-Asianism beyond the conventional equation of the concept with Japanese imperialism. So that's the kind of core of the argument that I'm trying to make, that this conventional idea that Pan-Asianism is all about political language put together by Japan for its own imperial purposes is not really fully supported by history, because there is a rich prehistory in the early 20th century that exposes how Pan-Asianism was taken up by the subaltern people in the global south, in Asia especially, who relied on this language of Pan-Asianism to fight back Western imperialism as an ideology and also as a strategy. Therefore, far from being an imperial ideology in itself, Pan-Asianism was in fact a response to European imperialism in the early 20th century, although the concept eventually ended up making a case for Japanese imperialism as history progressed towards the Second World War. Now, why we should bother? Now, as an international lawyer, we can at least talk about 4 different areas in which the use of Pan-Asianism as an anti-imperial ideology and as an anti-imperial strategy, 4 areas of international law was at least informed and shaped to some extent. First, the unity among Asian nations and the revival of Asian cultural heritage, the liberation of Asian nations from European colonization and the need to fight for it at both ideological and strategic level, and the vision of an Asian regional order. All this culminated or engaged with 4 different areas of international law. International law of neutrality, the question of the right to self-determination that became quite big in 1919, then the fight over the racial equality clause to be included in the Covenant of the League of Nations, and finally, the geopolitical aspect culminated into what we know now as the so-called Asian Monroe Doctrine. So given the time I have, I'm not going to get into details of all four, but let me at least touch upon some of these. So let me begin with this interesting story about international law of neutrality in a different way. As noted earlier, a good number of Indian revolutionary and Pan-Asianist leaders were active in San Francisco and New York as part of various nationalist organizations. We discussed that. And as we know, many of them were arrested, indicted, and there was a trial in San Francisco regarding their involvement in anti-British campaign. And the British were really, really angry about all this, that how come US territory is being used during war for actions against British interests, because US is supposed to be at that time, before joining the war itself, is a neutral state. And therefore, USA is under legal obligation to maintain its neutrality. So there were certain high level of diplomatic tension uh, between the US side and the UK side. UK side demanding that Britain maintain neutrality by Swiss standard, and under no circumstances they should allow Indian revolutionary leaders to use US soil to mount this kind of conspiracies and attacks against British rule in India. And they were also very angry about German involvement and the fact that USA is not really taking any concrete measure, which USA finally did. And you know, the office of the German consul was invaded, and a good number of people were arrested, which led to the exposure of Hindu-German conspiracy and the San Francisco trial. So that is one front of the debate about neutrality and the international law language used by Britain, accusing the US for violating neutrality principle under international law. So that is one front. On the another front, the neutrality debate saw an accusation, this time by US. So for the first chance, I said UK was accusing the US for violating neutrality by allowing US soil to be used by Indian nationalists. On the other hand, the neutrality kind of language was used by the US, that Britain violated its right as a neutral state, when the claim involved the British cruiser Laurenti firing blank and projectile shots to stop the US commercial ship, the SS China, on the high seas on the high seas on 18th February 1916. So at that time, as you know, USA was yet to join the war. So therefore, it was still a neutral state. After this kind of projectile attack on the SS China, British troops, they also arrested 28 Germans, 8 Austrians, and 2 Turks on board. The British Secretary of State, Grey, argued that British intelligence services had reliable information that the German passengers had, while resident in Shanghai, been engaged in the collection of arms and ammunition to smuggle to India to fuel revolutionary activities there. And it is on the basis of that secret information they attacked the USS China and arrested those individuals. Now, Americans were, of course, furious. The State Department insisted that none of the detained individuals was in military or naval services, and that international law principles were plain and definite, that only military and naval persons may be removed from the neutral vessels on the high seas. So this kind of heated exchange of letters, if you kind of dig into those kind of archive, you see the heated exchange of letters between Grey and Lansing, the counterparts in their respective foreign offices in the UK and the US. It went on and on and on. And the American side talked about the Trent case in 1816. the kind of neutrality principle at that time claimed by the UK against the USA. And the US argument was that this time UK violated the neutrality principle by arbitrarily removing German nationals from a civilian US mail ship. It went on and on. The argument between the two sides continued for the rest of 1916, and the British side brought forward new claims that these people were indeed involved in military activities, and US Department were persistent. The US State Department was persistent in asserting pressure for the release of those individuals, which were finally released. But this diplomatic episode and quite heated argument and debate and multifaceted diplomatic row between the US and UK on neutrality in many ways lost relevance when USA joined the war in 1917, April, as a co-belligerent. But this diplomatic episode is a useful reminder how various activities of Pan-Asianist activists and leaders using various avenues to advance their own anti-imperial goals and objectives created a kind of heated debate and discussion, and in the process shaped international law discourse on the right of neutrality, which in today's world became quite obsolete given the kind of collective security framework of the UN Charter, or also more importantly, the ideological divide of the world. But this Pan-Asianist rhetoric and activism as part of strategic use for anti-imperial purposes is a kind of useful reminder in that regard. The second point that I would like to talk about is the right to self-determination. In his address to the Congress on 8th January 1918, the US President Woodrow Wilson enshrined the notion of self-determination, without actually using the term, as one of the key guiding principles of the Great War international order. This promise of self-determination in the immediate aftermath of the war did indeed ignite hope among nationalist leaders in Asia and in Africa for independent statehood as part of Pan-Africanist and Pan-Asianist solidarity and vision. When Wilson declared the right to self-determination as one of the governing principles of the Paris Peace Conference 1919, the Indian Home Rule League in London submitted a petition to the great power of the conference arguing for India's independence under the principle. This is the kind of pamphlet and the cover page of the pamphlet that you see, which embodied the petition itself. The petition largely dealt with the question of Indian nationhood for the purpose of the right to self-determination. However, what is more relevant to our discussion on Pan-Asianism here is the way the petition responded to the question of whether India, and for that matter most colonial peoples, was ready to join the community of self-governing nations. Given that the core of colonial ideology was the proposition that colonized peoples were not capable of governing their own affairs, any demand for self-determination by subjected peoples was bound to encounter this question. And it is in this context that the Indian Home Rule League, based in London and then also in the US, engaged with the issue of trusteeship, offering a fascinating response that struck at the very root of the civilizational discourse of international law, reflecting in many ways the Pan-Asianist ideology of the Oriental spiritual civilization. So here in this petition, the way it talked about civilization and why India should get independence and should not be treated as an uncivilized colonial people, they relied very much on a language that echoes the Pan-Asianist ideology that we discussed earlier with reference to Okakura and Tagore. The petition first highlights the general premise that the theory of trusteeship predicates that the trustee himself is fit. Here, trustee meaning the UK, the Britain, and then ask, can the West be a fit trustee for the East? Can materialism be a fit trustee for spiritualism? The context is, at the time in the 1919, the British argument was, one day India will earn independence and self-rule, but India is not yet ready. And it is the responsibility of Britain to make India ready so that it can stand on its own feet. In this petition, they are putting forward a great challenge to that kind of rhetoric by saying Britain cannot pretend that it is the fit trustee to prepare India for independence. And that's the question here is, can the West, with its materialism, be a fit trustee for India, which relies on its spiritual civilization? The petition then argues that the notion of trusteeship was also invalid because the trustees, the UK, are appointed for minors, whereas India is one of the oldest civilizations noted for philosophy and for being the home of major religions of the world. In line with Pan-Asianist ideologues like Okakura, Tagore, and Okawa, the petition relied on ancient Asian traditions and the glorious past to refute the British claim of Indian incapacity to self-govern. It specifically highlights the rich democratic tradition evidenced in the Indian ancient past, comparing ancient Greek city-states with autonomous villages in ancient India. The petition notes that 500,000 village republics flourished in India for over 2,000 years before being exterminated with the introduction of centralized administration under British rule. So the point is simple, that don't question our long history of civilization, long history of self-governance, and now stop pretending that we need you as a trustee to prepare us for independence. The petition, of course, as we know, was unsuccessful, and India, like many other colonies in the non-European world, had to endure colonial rule for longer. But the argument that I made in this part of the paper is simple, that this petition demanding self-determination for India and its independence in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, the language that was put forward in support of India's independence, its long history, is heavily informed and shaped by Pan-Asianist ideologies that predates this petition. And in that sense, Pan-Asianism had a key role to play in shaping the political language demanding independence for India as part of the right to self-determination under international law. The third point that I would like to discuss is this idea of yellow peril and the debate and discussion on racial equality clause. Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 and the ensuing territorial gains and a series of other concessions from China created panic among European powers, mainly Russia, Germany, and France, which had vested interest in China. Thus, they joined forces and demanded the reversal of territorial concessions made by China to Japan. The triple intervention, as it came to be known, left Japan with few options but to submit to this demand, which of course Japanese elites saw as humiliating. It also provoked the country, Japan, to focus more on building military capacity. Following triple intervention, Britain expanded its diplomatic relationship with Japan, reflecting the common interest of containing Russia. The resulting Anglo-Japanese Alliance Treaty of 1902 helped Japan fight Russian occupation of Manchuria, leading to the Russo-Japanese War, and in 1905, Japan sealed its first victory in a war against a European power, which is Russia. The victory also allowed Japan to consolidate its position in Korea, ultimately annexing it 1910. The history is definitely far more complex than that. I don't pretend to be kind of an expert in that area. But this is a very useful background for understanding the panic that was quite evident in the West regarding this surprising rise of Japan as an imperial power. That is what I'm going to focus on. The panic engendered by Japan's emergence as a great power exposed the racial dimension of the West's perception of this Asian imperial power. In the West, the term yellow peril emerged as the shorthand for this panic. It was in the context of the resurgence of a yellow peril in the West that actually Okakura published his Awakening of Japan in 1905, in which he elaborated his Pan-Asianist thoughts because of this racial attack on Asian nations. This racist political concept first appeared in April 1895 as an ideological justification for the triple intervention following the Sino-Japanese War. The notion had spread throughout the Western world by the time of the Boxer Rebellion in 1899 to 1901, although violence against German missionaries turned into a pretext for Germany to occupy Jiaozhou Bay and allowed other powers to scramble for concessions, the massacre of the Westerners was essentially seen as in racial terms. The killing of the German missionaries and other foreigners was compared to the massacre of Europeans by Huns and Mongols in the Middle Ages. And against this backdrop, the victory of Yellow Japan over White Russia brought the fear of yellow peril to the reality that the West faced. This panic about Japan's rise as an imperial power also had an economic dimension. The French economist Edmond Thery, who argued that the Japanese ought to have been defeated by the Russians for the sake of European economic interests, concluded that if China, modeling after Japan, were ever to succeed in industrializing itself, these two Asiatic nations would present a mortal threat to Europe as economic competitors. And I think the West is very much living this moment as we speak. Similarly, an editorial published in the Times of India in May 1904 argued that, I quote, the real yellow peril remained in the possibility of losing the Chinese market or even China itself to Japan. It became almost impossible for Japan to avoid the issue of racism as the US enacted a series of racially discriminatory domestic legislation, such as the California Alien Land Law of 1913, and many of these laws, you know, specifically targeted the Japanese and also Chinese when it comes to immigration to the West Coast. And Australia also had similarly racist anti-Asian immigration policies. And it was very difficult for Japan, which was rising as an imperial power, defeating Russia, defeating China in two successive wars, and then facing this kind of humiliation on racial grounds. And they had to appease their domestic audience. And that put Japan in a very difficult position that you cannot demand and make those kind of assertions about superpower status, but at the same time, facing this level of racially based discrimination abroad. The Paris Peace Conference and the negotiation for drafting the Covenant of the League of Nations, the first supranational international institution to deal with international peace and order, offered Japan as a great power. As you know, Japan was one of the 5 great powers in the Paris Peace Conference. It offered Japan the perfect opportunity for a theatrical show of its demand for racial equality. On the slide, you see the Japanese delegates' original proposal regarding the racial equality, which was rejected. So the Japanese delegation, headed by Makino, initiated the racial equality clause, which they hope would be part of a covenant of the League of Nations. They shared multiple versions with the US President, Woodrow Wilson, and this is what was finally officially put forward, which was rejected because the Japanese demand for racial equality was immediately seen by Australia, by Canada, various Commonwealth countries as a kind of demand for racial equality when it comes to immigration. They saw this as kind of opening the floodgate for Asian immigration into Canada, into Australia. And they vehemently opposed this idea, which then made this extremely difficult for Japan to do anything about it. But at the same time, they had to appease their domestic audience and they had to find some sort of compromise. So if you compare on the slide, the watered down version is now this time not even a part of the covenant itself in terms of any substantive article, which was the initial proposal to amend Article 21. This time Japan is just looking for a way out from this embarrassing situation by simply saying that add this notion of racial equality, at least in the preamble, by the endorsement of the principle of equality of nations and just treatment of their nationals. Even this really, really minor insertion in the preamble of the Covenant of the League was also rejected because of very stubborn position from the Australian side and British view that they are not going to encourage an internal fight within Commonwealth countries, USA supporting the move, and finally this initiative failed, which was quite embarrassing for Japan. And the defeat of Japan's racial equality proposals underscored the omnipresence of racial hierarchy embedded in international order to the extent that the mere acknowledgement of equality of nations was not even included in the preamble of the League. And this in turn reignited a sense of need for cooperation among colored people and also for a collective action against racial discrimination. Pan-Asianism had already laid the normative foundation for such actions in Asia. In the aftermath of the Paris fiasco, Japanese policy thus radically changed from an evasive approach to Pan-Asianist activities by Indian leaders and their Japanese sympathizers to a more assertive approach incorporating Pan-Asianism in its official policy. And this is the turning moment. And with the realization that Japan was not treated as equal with Western great powers, despite Japan's status as a great power in the Paris Peace Conference, Pan-Asianism was revived by the traditional Asianists within the Japanese official circles. In this regard, it needs to be reiterated that Japan's racial equality proposal was never meant for racial equality. I think we have to take that point extremely seriously. And as I said at the beginning, the League of Nations moment of negotiation was a theatrical show for Japan because Japan never ever genuinely believed in racial equality when it came to other Asian nations. So this idea of racial equality was something else. It was more of political rhetoric rather than substantive equality among Asian nations because Japan also thought it was racially superior. Nonetheless, to the Pan-Asianists, the long-standing issue of racial justice gained a renewed importance as part of the anti-imperial agenda and also as an element of anti-colonial nationalist movement. After all, colonialism was primarily premised upon racial hierarchy. And this fiasco also directly led to a kind of disillusionment about the future of the League of Nations. To what extent the League, the new organization, is going to secure a better future for the oppressed people of the world. Self-determination denied, racial equality denied, and therefore that gave rise to something that came to be known as the Asian Monroe Doctrine. Now, you know about the Monroe Doctrine. I don't want to get into that. But the interesting bit here is this idea that Asia for the Asiatic led to a political rhetoric for creating a special domain for Asian conflict, which came to be known as Asian Monroe Doctrine, which was going to be led by Japan, which will secure freedom for other Asian nations like India. Those will be freed, and then Asia will emerge in its own right as a unified geopolitical bloc, very much like the American story about the Monroe Doctrine. So I don't have the time to elaborate this, but this rhetoric about the Asian Monroe Doctrine is something that got translated into the idea of Asiatic co-prosperity sphere that was very much part of Japan's imperialist rhetoric. And I think here the circle or the loop completes in a circular way. The way Pan-Asianism as an idea was created as an anti-imperial ideology, as an anti-imperial strategy, then gradually lost its way, and then in the hands of the Japanese imperial project itself emerged as an imperial project and language itself. And of course, the world soon witnessed in utter horror what such a hegemonic vision of regional order unfolded in Asia in the final years of the Second World War. And with this, the concept of Pan-Asianism, despite all its anti-imperial ideological and strategic relevance, became the unfortunate symbol of imperialism and gradually sank into intellectual, political, and legal insignificance. Now, let me, how much time, Chris, I can take? Like, is it all right if I take like 5 minutes?
Yeah, we're very flexible. So you have, I mean, take as much as you want, just as long as you give us at least 15 minutes for Q&A, I think.
Sure, that's fine. So now I'm going to actually share some of my concluding thoughts, because after a long narrative of how Pan-Asianism worked as an ideology, as a strategy, and how it shaped our thinking about international law at that time, let me just pull all this together and share some of my reflective thoughts. The narrative I gave you reveals that far from being merely a language of hegemony and power put forward by Japan for its imperial projects in Asia during the Second World War, Pan-Asianism had complex roles to play in the early 20th century. As an anti-imperial ideology, Pan-Asianism put forward a normative argument for the emancipation of Asia from Western imperialism and provided an alternative vision of civilization. As an anti-imperial strategy, Pan-Asianism offered Indian nationalist leaders in exile the language that they needed to gain support in favor of their nationalist movement. And as you have seen, they have also shaped international law understanding in different areas of the time: law of neutrality, right to self-determination, racial equality, and of course, Asian Monroe Doctrine. This analysis of international law dimension of Pan-Asianism as an anti-imperial ideology and as an anti-imperial strategy in the early 20th century sheds light on an important yet ignored episode of the historical development of international law. On another level, the story of Pan-Asianism as anti-imperialism remains a story of failed promises and hopes beyond ideology and strategy. One may argue that such promises and hopes were doomed to failure due to their sheer naivety alone. Rash Behari Bose, for example, remained committed to Indian independence and a supporter of Pan-Asianism until his death in January 1945, even as Pan-Asianism took a violent imperialist turn in the hands of the Japanese policymakers. As Erihotta eloquently notes, Bose, by the end of his life, was a man of several allegiances, beholden to them by blood, circumstances, and marriage. He was an Indian independence fighter, a Pan-Asianist, a Japanese citizen married to an influential Japanese family, and a Japanese ultra-nationalist who believed in the legitimacy of Japan's leadership in Asia. Even at the time of his death, Bose still believed that India would gain independence with the help of Japan. He, however, did not live long enough to see Indian independence or the defeat of Japan in World War II or the death of his son, who was killed in Okinawa during the final phase of the war. On the other hand, it is argued that even after Japan's humiliating defeat in the war and the ensuing US occupation of the country, in a number of Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, Japanese soldiers helped local people in their ongoing fight against Western colonial powers. Thus, like the concept itself, the promises, hopes, legacies, and histories of Pan-Asianism are far from singular. Now, what the story of Pan-Asianism as an anti-imperial ideology and rhetoric and strategy tell us today? Pan-Asianism in these dark times call for a renewed sense of Asian solidarity, which in turn transcends regional boundaries and paves the way for a much broader global South solidarity. Historically, the anti-imperial sentiment of Pan-Asianism, as I have discussed earlier, was also shared by Pan-Africanist movement during the interwar period. Both Pan-Asianists and Pan-Africanists submitted petitions to great powers during Paris peace negotiations, demanding an end to colonial rule under the principle of self-determination. The historic Bandung Conference of 1955 of newly independent Asian and African nations jointly underscored the principles of sovereign equality, mutual respect, and cooperation in the working of international law and institutions. Bandung developed global principles against imperialism in all forms. In many ways, Bandung embodies the core principles of the Panchshil Agreement of 1954, which is the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence between nations. So it's kind of very iconic India-China bilateral peace agreement based on this Panchshil Agreement. To take a more recent example, it is South Africa, which brought Israel before the ICJ under the Genocide Convention. Latin American countries of Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia have called out genocidal actions and in many cases even severe diplomatic ties with Israel. Nicaragua legally challenged Germany's role in aiding Israeli genocide. More than 50 countries intervened in the ICJ case on Palestine's right to self-determination. Therefore, when we think about Pan-Asianism today, its anti-imperial potentials need to be contextualized in a global South solidarity beyond the geographical confines of Asia, meaning Pan-Asianism is far bigger than Asia in the current moment in time. Also, Pan-Asianism like any other regional configurations, need to be attentive to the core principles of sovereignty or sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and mutual respect and cooperation. Pan-Asianism is not a license for arbitrary imperial expansion. To make any sense to less powerful nations in the developing world, such an anti-imperial regionalism must have egalitarian inclusiveness at its heart so that new forms of imperialism do not take roots in respective regions. The story of Pan-Asianism in the early 20th century offers a powerful reminder in this regard. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much for that incredibly fascinating, rich tour de force exploration of sort of the history of various aspects of the history of Pan-Asianism in, from sort of the late 19th century to the post-World War II decade. I'm sure everyone in the audience is forcibly muted, so you won't be able to hear their applause. But otherwise, I'm sure we would have a great round of applause now. So let me remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can either send them to me or just raise your hand or send me a message letting me know you have a question. I think if you raise your hand, I should see that. And I have some questions already, but maybe I'll and I have far too many of my own to ask them all. But maybe I'll take the chair's prerogative to just sort of to start with one, which is kind of about sort of different strands within the Pan-Asianism that your paper and your presentation brought out, right? So of course as you emphasize, there's kind of the Japanese political component of the history, but also I'm kind of interested in as you would, of course, the some of the South Asian Pan-Asianists in the early period you're mentioning, they're tending more in the direction of radical politics, of course, as well as being a period of growing anti-colonial activism. We have sort of socialism, anarchism on the rise globally, but the sort of general emphasis on historical, spiritual themes as opposed to materialism sits uneasily with kind of that more radical, potentially Marxist or sort of economic issue exploitation in the context of work, maybe focused types of movements. And so I'm wondering just, on whether sort of before or after the First World War or whatever period, to what extent you see kind of ideological tensions within the Pan-Asianist movement in this period, kind of even above and beyond the obvious kind of potential tensions over Japan's political utilization of the idea with increasing, sort of clarity as time went on.
Thank you. And this is a kind of a very important and fascinating question. So after the Great War, and given some of the actions taken by Japan in Korea and elsewhere, the ideological function of Pan-Asianism, the idea that through this kind of ideological reconstruction of Asia, and under the leadership of Japan, Asia has a future, was almost a dead idea. No one took it seriously that this ideological construction, the kind of spirituality that Tagore and everyone talked about, it did. Tagore was almost furious that you cannot talk about civilization on a pile of dead body of your fellow Asian brothers. So this was his very strong condemnation of the direction of travel that the Japanese took vis-a-vis other Asian countries, especially Korea and various other parts of China. So that ideological reconstruction was dead. But when it comes to the strategic use of Pan-Asianism, it also failed to some extent because of the lack of capacity. In Japan, the Pan-Asianist group based in Tokyo or in San Francisco, they could not really convince their donors that they actually have the capacity to do anything substantive with the money to remove and kick out the British from India. Having said that, as you rightly say, the radical fringe of Indian nationalist movement, the mainstream movement was led by Congress and those kind of formal political channel who were not in favor of this kind of radical move. They were more in favor of enjoying and securing independence through political negotiation, through constitutionalism. But the radical fringe uh, remained kind of committed to this idea that we will have to secure support from alternative sources. And rather than having independence as a kind of negotiated outcome, uh, we can secure support from all those alternative sources. So, for example, the most iconic and the most popular example would be Subhas Chandra Bose, not the Raj Bihari Bose I discussed in this paper, but Subhas Chandra Bose during the Second World War, making an alliance with Japan, whereas the Congress was, of course, supporting the British war efforts. So it remained to some extent, if not purely through this language of Pan-Asianism, but this idea within this radical fringe that they will secure support from alternative sources to fight back the British in a more radical way remained until the end. So these parallel streams, they coexisted to a great extent, although there was serious level of imbalance of power. So that would be kind of my initial response to that, but also seen from the Japanese point of view, they co-opted this idea and the language of Pan-Asianism, which had absolutely nothing to do with the ideological construction of Pan-Asianism in the early part of the 20th century. So, and for that reason, Pan-Asianism very much lost its glory, lost its color, and lost its ideological premise, because what then came to be known as Pan-Asianism was not anything like what was propagated by people like Tagore, Okawa, or Okakura. So that would be my take on your question.
Great. Thanks so much. And another question, and this one I have sort of a question from the audience, and also sort of my own version of a very similar question. So I'll kind of roll them together. So you know, as you've been exploring, right, this kind of the and as we were just discussing, there's the particular role of Japan in this history that has to be addressed. And then there's sort of the potential of what could have been or what partly was, or this other vision that's going on alongside that. And so I guess what, you know, I guess the big picture question is kind of, is it a contingency issue? Is it just unfortunate that Japan had this particular role in this history and it kind of, you know, tainted and made the concept so problematic? Or is it something structural about, you know, perhaps just having a, you know, the unification around a sort of anti-politics, there's like a regional sort of politics, but potentially without a clear further substance, or kind of a resistance to something, but not quite sure what, in the name of what. So in the, you know, the question from the audience in that's posing that in really structural terms is, I wonder whether the concept of Pan-Asianism outweighs the disadvantages, or does more harm than good for the relatively weak countries in Asia in practice. And then also, just to add another piece to that, you know, then I'm interested in, as you know, or as you noted towards the very end of your talk, the other sort of similar thing, which was Pan-Africanism, which obviously it has a lot of sort of similar anti-colonial orientation, similar pro-regional orientation, but I don't think ever really, I mean, never became quite so problematized, perhaps because there was no, equivalent hegemon over there. So yeah, sorry, that's sort of some loose thoughts, but if you could kind of address them.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a difficult question. I don't know really how to do justice to that. It's so complex and difficult question. Even with the benefit of hindsight now after all these years, still I don't think we know exactly how the future could have been, whether there was really an alternative future or is it always something that was going to be. We don't know, but so these are some of my thoughts. My general feeling is, and actually that to a great extent shaped my second book that you mentioned in the introduction, the post-coloniality. I think that is something that we have to take seriously because the mainstream political elites in post-colonial Asian countries have never taken this notion of Asianism seriously. That would be one of my views. And there are all sorts of reasons, including geopolitics, big power play, mutual lack of mutual respect and trust. And this lack is not a kind of product, it's a product of the greater geopolitics itself. So what happened as a result is Asia could not really emancipate itself from the colonial making of Asia. And even the way we talk about various Asian region, the Middle East and everything, these are so Eurocentric. These are so compartmentalized that Asia could never really, the way it has been fragmented, Asia could never actually have that imagination of a political bloc. So, of course, there are cultural diversities. The Middle East is very different from Far East. Having said that, the very making of Asia as a geopolitical bloc is very much a colonial construct. And unless and until that colonial construct is decolonized, unless and until Asia takes charge of its own political imagination, uh, we are not really going to make much out of that Pan-Asianist ideology or rhetoric. So that is number one. Number two, in today's world, if I compare with, so one of the core component of Pan-Asian ideology was the leadership role of Japan. And this is something that was always going to be very difficult to reconcile with, because if the system itself is based on what Carl Schmitt called the kind of Grossraum sort of rhetoric, that there will be a geographical bloc, but within that bloc there will be a regional hegemon, in itself is counterproductive to this idea of philosophical construction of Asia based on spirituality, because this idea of hegemonic control of one big power in itself is counterproductive to that spiritual aspect, because that hegemony comes from the very materialist civilization, imperialism being the obvious outcome of that hyper materialist exploitation and accumulation. So if that is the case, then that version of Pan-Asianism was going to fail anyway, because it's counterproductive to the very ideological core. So in that sense, it is important, and that is what some of my concluding remarks were all about, that if we want to take this kind of regional or regionalism seriously, we have to take egalitarianism also seriously, with the idea of mutual respect, because unless and until have that, this kind of regional ideologies and rhetoric will always be in the hands of the powerful as a tool for expanding their influence, their domain of influence. And that has been the case with Japan in the 20th century, and that will be the case in the 21st century if we don't learn from past mistakes and if we keep doing it. So to materialize that true potential of Pan-Asianism, we have to take into account the positionalities of less powerful countries in those regional blocs first, and then you have to decolonize the colonial construct of those regions, because these are highly problematic construction. The way we think about Asia today is extremely problematic, extremely problematic. This kind of Central Asia, Far East, Middle East, these are so Eurocentric. So this has to be colonized. And once we do, then with the help of kind of crossing boundaries, finding common ground, this kind of egalitarianism at its core, this regionalism has huge potential. And I am a firm believer in that potential. And it's not only Asian regionalism. I see this, as I was saying in my concluding remark, as part of global South solidarity. And I think that's the only way we can collectively come together and fight back whatever hegemony and dominance we see in today's world.
Great, thanks so much. I'm gonna follow that very, broad, stirring response with a very particular question, or in a way, although maybe it has a broad themes as well. But so actually, I was also very interested in the that self-determination for India petition you mentioned, sort of other similar petitions. And I know this is, perhaps a difficult question to answer because it might be more of a sense thing, but I was wondering sort of, I can see many different types of audiences for that self-determination petition, right? First of all, I guess Britain, the colonial power over India, or, European colonial powers in general, or sort of European states, or Wilson in the United States, or the Latin American nations, or other Asian nations, or sort of just a self, like more of a self affirmation of trying to movement build. I guess your presentation already links it to the other Asian nations in a way because of the Pan-Asianist language. But I wonder sort of your thoughts in terms of who you see as the primary sort of addressees of a statement like that one.
Yeah, so Pan-Asianism, sorry, the idea of self-determination is such a broad idea. And when Wilson presented this idea as a kind of core principle of the post-war international order, his primary audience was the European audience, and in a very specific way. So his primary idea was that all the territories occupied by Germany, like Belgium, has to come up as an independent nation. But the language was the right to self-determination, but also at the same time, if you look into the archival materials at that time, there was a serious level of anxiety and also commitment within the US delegates because they feared in the aftermath of the First World War. So two major empires have collapsed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And Germany is a defeated power with some less lucrative colonial outposts like Namibia and certain Pacific Island and everywhere. Within the US delegation, the commitment was firm that under no circumstances we should listen to the French and the British proposal to recolonize those new territories. The idea was British and the French, they will give some of those territories to the US and distribute in like the old cases, in colonized territories. American delegation was vehemently opposed to this idea. And the idea was we are emerging on the global stage for the first time. The center of power has been shifted from this side of Atlantic to our side of the Atlantic. And the signal that we are going to give to the world is we are the force for the good. We are not like European imperial power. We are not going to colonize. So this language of self-determination was mostly about that. The idea that all people will govern their own affair and USA is as the new global power is the custodian of that hope. It, of course, went out of his hand. Even delegates within his team were furious about the kind of loose rhetoric about self-determination because it could have damaging consequences. So if you read the kind of diary entries of his people in his delegation, they were like absolutely critical. There were so many German minorities in so many newly created countries like Poland. The Germans overnight became, because the redrawing of European boundaries, Germans overnight became the largest minority in the world, distributed in all those countries. Now, if we apply this principle of self-determination, which would mean all these people, all these territories where German are the majority, become part of Germany, and as a result, Germany expands quite significantly. And that is kind of absurd idea that after all this war, and we defeat Germany, and then Germany becomes bigger as part of the right to self-determination. So there were all sorts of different audiences, and it created all sorts of different trouble. French and the British made it very clear we are not thinking about decolonization as part of the right to self-determination. That's not going to happen. And that's how we, as you know, they created the mandate system as a compromise to deal with the Ottoman territories in the Middle East, rather than colonizing those territories as a whole. So it's a very complex and large story. But the interesting point in this paper is how colonial people in Asia and Africa, they relied so heavily on this magical notion of self-determination, uh, and they claimed their independence. One Indian leader even said that Wilson is the reincarnation of God in human form, because this God is now going to give independence to India. So it created a massive hype, and there were all sorts of petitions. So this story about Pan-Asianism and this petition to self-determination captures only a very small and specific part of that larger story about the right to self-determination. For Wilson, the primary target was definitely Europe and the surrounding areas, not Indians, to be sure.
Fantastic. Okay, we have a question from one member of the audience. So let me see if I can. 1 second. To
Hi, Professor Shahabuddin. Thank you for your talk and your paper. It was very fascinating. So my question is, what drew you to the particular instances or events and legal or international legal themes that you cover in your paper?
Sorry, I don't think I understood the question. If you could go again, Michelle, please. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah. So my question is, what drew you to the events and international legal themes that you cover in the paper?
So thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your interest in the paper, and I hope you get a chance to read it. It's quite long, but anyway. So my engagement with international law aspect came actually a bit later. So my initial interest was in this idea of Pan-Asianism itself. So here we talk a lot about regionalism in today's world, Asian Mondo Doctrine, and all sorts of things. So having looked into Pan-Asianist literature, I was quite surprised by the way it is almost occupied by this mainstream discourse on how it was used by Japan as an imperial language and everything. And that took me to various archival sources to find the prehistory of Pan-Asianism. And in the process of putting together a narrative of the prehistory of Pan-Asianism beyond this kind of 1945 sort of thing, various specific events came into play, which I was not aware of. So, for example, this fascinating story about the SS China and US, the UK bombardment of it, is on its own is a kind of interesting story. But why and how it links to this Pan-Asianist language and rhetoric was a great challenge for me to connect those dots. But at the same time, it was also quite fascinating to find how this neutrality debate between US and UK on both fronts involved various actors who were involved in Pan-Asianist things. So this is one specific event. There are also other, so I have been working on the right to self-determination for a long time. So for my work on minorities, self-determination has been a very important point. But I never thought about self-determination as part of Pan-Asianist rhetoric. But when I was reading all those petitions and everything, it was quite surprising to find out how closely the petition in 1990 actually built on some of the ideological writing on Pan-Asianism. So that is kind of another very specific episode of the history of international law that I looked into. There were some other kind of bits and pieces that are not part of the paper because the paper was getting too long, and also the connection between Pan-Asianism and those ideas of international law is quite interesting. I didn't have time today to talk about something more specific, but from Chinese point of view, this idea of Asian Mondo Doctrine, so this idea of Mondo Doctrine was incorporated in the Covenant of the League of Nations. And this specific event of international law is actually very, very fascinating. I didn't discuss today. Maybe Michelle, you might be interested. So the language in which these regional understandings, which was basically referred to the US Mondo Doctrine, was included in the Covenant of the League, was a matter of serious concern for China. Chinese argument is that I don't mind having an official recognition of US Mondo Doctrine, is your problem, but the way you are doing it in a kind of plurality, understanding, it almost gives the legal basis to Japanese claim. And that created a serious level of anxiety and tension between the Chinese delegate and the US delegate and other delegation within the League of Nations sort of covenant negotiation in relation to Article 21. So that is another very specific event of international law, which I did not discuss today, but you might be interested. If you ask me about my most favorite one, I found that diplomatic row between Gray and Lansing quite fascinating, and the language. At one point, US demanded apology from the British side. It is a fascinating story and full of kind of color. In the paper also, I couldn't give the full narration, but a chapter is coming as part of a book on Cambridge History of International Law, where I have expanded quite significantly the ideological and the strategic aspects. So maybe this is something you might be interested in reading.
Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, I'm sure many of us, myself included, will look forward a lot to reading that chapter. And when we find a good fight in the archives, it's always a great pleasure. And everything around the SS China was super interesting to me as well as an episode. So I feel we've run to the end of our allotted time. So I'm sure I speak for everybody, forcibly muted again as they are, in expressing our collective thanks for that fantastic talk. I hope Shahab, you have a fantastic rest of your day. I encourage everyone to go out and read the paper if you haven't already, because you'll get many more great details on all of the themes that were discussed today.